Welcome to the Sleep Scholar. Tonight, we'll explore a quiet corner of history together. Settle in, close your eyes, and let these gentle facts carry you into deep sleep. The 14th century in Italy marked a profound yet gradual transformation in human thought, one that would eventually reshape the entire European continent and beyond. To understand this period properly, we must first examine the conditions that made such intellectual awakening possible, beginning with the unique political and economic landscape of the Italian peninsula during this era. Italy, unlike much of medieval Europe, was not unified under a single monarchy, but rather consisted of numerous independent city-states, each with its own government, economic interests, and cultural developments. Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, and other prominent cities had, by the early 1300s, established themselves as centers of commerce and banking, creating wealth that would prove essential to the cultural renaissance that was about to unfold. The Medici family, though not yet at the height of their influence, were already beginning to accumulate the financial resources that would later fund countless artistic and scholarly endeavors. Records from this period indicate that Italian merchants had established trade networks extending from the North Sea to the Black Sea, bringing not only material wealth but also exposure to diverse ideas and knowledge systems from across the known world. The intellectual climate of early 14th century Italy was still dominated by medieval scholasticism, a philosophical and educational system that had governed European thought for several centuries. This approach, which sought to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian theology, was primarily associated with the works of Thomas Aquinas and other church scholars. However, by approximately 1300, certain Italian thinkers were beginning to express dissatisfaction with the limitations of purely theological inquiry, seeking instead to explore human experience and classical learning in their own right. Petrarch, born Francesco Petrarca in 1304 in the town of Arezzo, is often cited by historians as the first true Renaissance humanist, though he himself would not have used such terminology. His father, a notary who had been exiled from Florence due to political conflicts, provided young Francesco with access to legal and administrative circles, exposing him early to the practical concerns of civic life. Petrarch's education took him to Montpellier and Bologna, where he studied law, though his true passion lay elsewhere in the literature and philosophy of ancient Rome. It was Petrarch who began the systematic search for lost classical manuscripts, a pursuit that would become central to Renaissance scholarship. In 1345, he discovered a collection of letters by the Roman statesman Cicero in the Cathedral Library of Verona, a find that profoundly influenced his understanding of classical antiquity. These letters revealed Cicero not as the idealized figure presented in medieval texts, but as a complex human being engaged in the political struggles of his time, dealing with personal conflicts, ambitions, and moral dilemmas that seemed remarkably contemporary to 14th century readers. Petrarch's approach to classical texts differed markedly from that of medieval scholars, where scholastics had primarily valued ancient writings for their utility in supporting Christian doctrine. Petrarch appreciated them for their insights into human nature, their literary beauty, and their historical significance. He coined the term Dark Ages to describe the period between the fall of Rome and his own time, arguing that classical learning represented a golden age that should be recovered and emulated. This perspective, historians believe, marked the beginning of what we now recognize as Renaissance historical consciousness. The poet's influence extended beyond scholarship to vernacular literature. His Canzoniere, a collection of poems largely devoted to his idealized love for a woman he called Laura, established new standards for lyric poetry throughout Europe. Written primarily in Italian rather than Latin, these works demonstrated that the vernacular languages could achieve the same literary sophistication as classical tongues. This development proved crucial for the spread of Renaissance ideas beyond the educated elite who could read Latin. Petrarch's younger contemporary Giovanni Boccaccio, born in 1313, further advanced the humanist program through both his scholarly work and his creative writing. Boccaccio spent much of his youth in Naples, then under the rule of Robert of Anjou, where he was exposed to a cosmopolitan court culture that valued learning and artistic achievement. His early works, including the Filocolo and the Teseida, drew heavily on classical sources while addressing contemporary concerns about love, honor, and human relationships. The Decameron, completed by Boccaccio around 1353, represents perhaps the most significant work of vernacular prose fiction produced during the early Renaissance period. Set during the plague years of 1348, the work presents 100 stories told by a group of young people who have fled Florence to escape the Black Death. These tales, drawn from classical sources, medieval literature, and contemporary oral tradition, offer a remarkably comprehensive view of 14th century Italian society, from the highest levels of the nobility to the humblest peasants and urban workers. What makes the Decameron particularly significant for understanding Renaissance thought is its treatment of human nature. Unlike medieval literature, which typically presented characters as embodiments of particular virtues or vices, Boccaccio's figures are psychologically complex individuals whose motivations and actions reflect the full range of human experience. Religious themes, while present, do not dominate the narrative, and moral judgments are often ambiguous or left to the reader's discretion. Boccaccio's scholarly contributions were equally important for the development of Renaissance humanism. He undertook extensive research into classical mythology, producing the Genealogia Deorum Gentilium, a comprehensive encyclopedia of pagan gods and heroes that became an essential reference work for later Renaissance artists and writers. He also wrote De Mulieribus Claris, a collection of biographies of famous women from history and legend, demonstrating the humanist interest in individual achievement and character development. The emergence of humanism in 14th century Italy cannot be understood apart from the broader social and economic changes occurring during this period. The growth of urban centers had created a new class of educated merchants, bankers, and professionals who possessed both the leisure and resources necessary for intellectual pursuits. Unlike the medieval nobility, whose education focused primarily on military skills and basic literacy, or the clergy, whose learning was directed toward theological questions. This urban bourgeoisie sought knowledge that would enhance their effectiveness in commercial and civic affairs. The Italian city-states, with their republican forms of government, place particular emphasis on rhetoric and persuasive speaking, skills that were essential for success in political life. This practical need led to renewed interest in classical Roman authors such as Cicero and Quintilian, whose works on oratory provided models for effective public speaking. Gradually, however, this utilitarian approach to classical learning expanded to encompass broader questions about ethics, politics, and human behavior. The University of Padua, founded in 1222, became particularly important as a center for the new learning. By the 14th century, it had established itself as one of Europe's leading institutions for the study of medicine, law, and natural philosophy. The university's emphasis on empirical observation and logical analysis provided an intellectual framework that proved compatible with humanist approaches to classical texts and contemporary problems. Florence, more than any other city, exemplified the social conditions that fostered early Renaissance culture. The city's republican government, dominated by wealthy merchants and bankers, actively promoted learning and artistic achievement as expressions of civic pride and political legitimacy. The Florentine dialect, largely due to the influence of Dante's Divine Comedy, had begun to establish itself as a literary language capable of sophisticated expression, making it possible for ideas developed in scholarly circles to reach broader audiences. Dante Alighieri, though he died in 1321, before the full flowering of Renaissance humanism, played a crucial role in establishing the intellectual foundations for later developments. His Divine Comedy, completed shortly before his death, represented the culmination of medieval Christian thought, while simultaneously pointing toward new possibilities for human knowledge and achievement. The poem's detailed descriptions of classical figures in hell and purgatory demonstrated extensive familiarity with ancient literature, while its sophisticated theological arguments showed how classical learning could be integrated with Christian belief. Perhaps more importantly, Dante's political writings, particularly his De Monarchia, addressed questions about government and social organization that would become central to Renaissance political theory. His argument for the separation of secular and religious authority challenged medieval assumptions about the relationship between church and state, providing intellectual groundwork for later humanist discussions of civic virtue and political responsibility. The artistic developments of 14th century Italy paralleled and reinforced the intellectual changes we have been examining. Giotto di Bondone, born around 1267 in the village of Colle di Vespignano near Florence, revolutionized painting through his emphasis on naturalistic representation and psychological depth. His frescoes in the Arena Chapel in Padua, completed between 1303 and 1305, departed dramatically from the stylized, symbolic art of the Byzantine tradition that had dominated medieval European painting. Giotto's figures possess weight, volume, and emotional expressiveness that were unprecedented in European art. His scenes from the life of Christ present religious subjects in terms that emphasize their human significance, showing the sacred figures as individuals capable of the full range of human emotions. This approach reflects the same interest in human psychology and individual experience that characterized the literary works of Petrarch and Boccaccio. The influence of classical sculpture is evident in Giotto's work, though he would have had limited access to ancient originals. His knowledge of classical art forms came primarily through Roman sarcophagi and other sculptural fragments that survived in Italian churches and collections. This indirect engagement with classical models became typical of early Renaissance artists who sought to recover ancient techniques and aesthetic principles while adapting them to contemporary subjects and purposes. By the middle of the 14th century, the intellectual and cultural changes we have described were beginning to coalesce into a recognizable movement, though contemporary participants would not have described their activities in such terms. The concept of a Renaissance, or rebirth, was largely a later historical construction, developed by 19th century scholars seeking to understand the transition from medieval to modern European culture. However, the period from approximately 1340 to 1370 did witness an acceleration of the trends we have been examining, as humanist ideas spread from Florence to other Italian centers of learning. The plague years of 1347 to 1351, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, paradoxically contributed to the spread of Renaissance culture by concentrating wealth in fewer hands and creating opportunities for social advancement among survivors. The psychological impact of the plague also encouraged a more secular outlook, as traditional religious explanations for suffering seemed inadequate to explain the catastrophe that had befallen European society. Thus, as we conclude our examination of the dawn of Renaissance thought in 14th century Italy, we can see how a combination of economic prosperity, political independence, classical learning, and artistic innovation created the conditions for a fundamental transformation in European intellectual life. The work of figures such as Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Giotto established patterns of thought and expression that would influence European culture for centuries to come, marking the true beginning of what historians recognize as the Renaissance period. This intellectual foundation brings us directly to the central figure of Francesco Petrarca, known to history as Petrarch, whose life from 1304 to 1374 encompasses what many scholars consider the pivotal decades in the emergence of Renaissance humanism. Born in Arezzo on July 20th, 1304, to Pietro di Parenzo, a notary who had been exiled from Florence alongside Dante Alighieri in 1302. Petrarch's early years were shaped by the political upheavals that characterized early 14th century Italian city-states. His family moved frequently during his childhood, settling first in Incisa, then relocating to Carpentras in 1312, when his father sought opportunities in the papal court that had recently established itself in Avignon. The Avignon papacy, which historians refer to as the Babylonian captivity of the Church, lasting from 1309 to 1377, created a unique intellectual environment that would profoundly influence Petrarch's development. In this cosmopolitan court, located in what is now southern France, young Francesco encountered manuscripts and ideas from across Europe, while his father's position provided access to learned circles that included canon lawyers, theologians, and scholars from various regions. Records indicate that Petrarch began his formal education in Carpentras around 1316, studying grammar and rhetoric under the guidance of Convenevole da Prato, a respected teacher who had previously instructed students in Tuscany. Following his father's wishes, Petrarch commenced legal studies at the University of Montpellier in 1320, then continued at the University of Bologna from 1322 to 1326. However, contemporary accounts suggest that he found jurisprudence tedious and instead devoted much of his time to reading classical authors, particularly Cicero and Virgil, whose works he acquired whenever possible. Upon his father's death in 1326, Petrarch abandoned his legal career entirely, taking minor orders in the church to secure financial stability while pursuing his literary and scholarly interests. This decision, documented in various 14th century sources, marked the beginning of his systematic effort to recover and study classical texts, an endeavor that would define humanist scholarship for generations. Petrarch's return to Avignon in 1326 coincided with his famous first glimpse of Laura, traditionally identified as Laura de Noves, wife of Hugues de Sade, on April 6, 1327, at the Church of St. Clair. While the historical existence of Laura remains debated among scholars, her literary significance in Petrarch's Canzoniere, or song book, cannot be understated. This collection of 366 poems, written primarily in vernacular Italian rather than Latin, established new conventions for lyric poetry that influenced European literature for centuries. The work demonstrates Petrarch's innovative approach to classical forms, adapting the sonnet structure to express deeply personal emotions while maintaining the rhetorical sophistication of ancient models. During the 1330s, Petrarch embarked on extensive travels throughout Europe, driven by his passion for discovering classical manuscripts in monastic libraries and cathedral schools. His journeys took him to Paris in 1333, where he examined texts at the Sorbonne, then to Flanders and Germany, where he sought works by ancient authors that had been preserved in remote religious institutions. In 1333, during a visit to Liège, Petrarch discovered two previously unknown orations by Cicero pro Archia and pro Marcello, a find that exemplified the humanist project of recovering classical learning. These discoveries were methodically catalogued and copied, forming the foundation of what historians now recognize as the first systematic attempt to reconstruct the corpus of ancient literature since the fall of Rome. Petrarch's scholarly methodology represented a revolutionary departure from medieval approaches to classical texts. Rather than viewing ancient authors primarily as sources of moral examples or rhetorical techniques, he sought to understand them within their historical contexts, developing what modern scholars term a historical consciousness. His letters, of which approximately 350 survive, reveal a systematic approach to textual criticism, comparison of manuscript variants, and careful attention to linguistic authenticity. In his famous letter to Homer, written around 1360, Petrarch expressed frustration at his inability to read Greek, lamenting that he could only appreciate the great epic poet through Latin translations, a limitation that would motivate subsequent humanists to study Greek language and literature directly. The year 1337 marked a significant milestone in Petrarch's career when he began work on his epic poem Africa, celebrating the Roman general Scipio Africanus and his victory over Hannibal. Written in Latin hexameters and modeled on Virgil's Aeneid, Africa represented Petrarch's attempt to revive classical epic poetry for contemporary audiences. Although he never completed the work to his satisfaction, news of the project spread throughout European intellectual circles, contributing to his growing reputation as a scholar-poet. Simultaneously, he commenced his Rerum Memorandarum Libri, or Books of Memorable Things, an encyclopedic collection of moral examples drawn from classical and Christian sources, organized according to virtues such as prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Recognition of Petrarch's literary achievements reached its zenith on April 8, 1341, when he received the Poet's Crown of Laurel on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, a ceremony that consciously imitated ancient Roman practices. The honor, sponsored by King Robert of Naples and approved by the Roman Senate, represented the first such coronation since classical antiquity and established Petrarch as the preeminent literary figure of his generation. Contemporary chronicles describe the elaborate ceremony conducted by Senator Orso dell'Anguillara, which included formal examination of Petrarch's knowledge of classical literature and his own poetic compositions. The event symbolized the humanist conviction that literature and scholarship deserved public recognition comparable to military or political achievements. Following his coronation, Petrarch settled in Vaucluse, near Avignon, where he established a kind of literary retreat that attracted scholars and writers from across Europe. His house, situated in a valley he described as perfectly suited for contemplation, became a center for humanist learning, where visitors could examine his growing library of classical manuscripts and engage in discussions about ancient philosophy, poetry, and history. Archaeological evidence suggests that the residence included a scriptorium, where Petrarch personally copied important texts, often adding his own annotations and corrections based on comparison with other manuscripts. His collection eventually included works by Livy, Quintilian, Propertius, and other authors whose texts had been rare or entirely unknown during the high medieval period. Petrarch's approach to classical philosophy, particularly his engagement with Augustine and Cicero, illustrates the distinctive characteristics of early Renaissance humanism. In his Secretum, composed between 1347 and 1353, he created an imaginary dialogue between himself and St. Augustine, mediated by Lady Truth, exploring the tension between worldly ambition and spiritual salvation. This work demonstrates how humanist thinkers sought to reconcile classical learning with Christian doctrine, arguing that study of ancient wisdom could enhance rather than threaten religious faith. Unlike medieval scholastics, who typically subordinated classical texts to theological authorities, Petrarch treated ancient authors as worthy of study in their own right, while maintaining his Christian convictions. The Black Death, which devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351, profoundly affected Petrarch's worldview and literary production. The plague claimed numerous friends and colleagues, including Laura, who died on April 6, 1348, exactly 21 years after their first meeting, according to Petrarch's carefully maintained records. His response to these losses appears in the second part of his Canzoniere, where themes of mortality and spiritual reflection replace the earlier focus on unrequited love and worldly concerns. During this period, he also composed several treatises on the vicissitudes of fortune, drawing extensively on classical authors such as Seneca and Boethius, while addressing contemporary concerns about social upheaval and political instability. Petrarch's final decades were marked by increasing involvement in Italian politics and continued literary productivity. In 1353, he permanently left Avignon and settled in Italy, living successively in Milan, Venice, and finally Arqua, near Padua, where he died on July 19, 1374. His political writings from this period include numerous letters to rulers and civic leaders, advocating for Italian unity and the restoration of Rome as a center of European civilization. His famous letter to the Roman tribune, Cola di Rienzo, written in 1347, exemplifies humanist political thought, combining classical republican ideals with contemporary concerns about Italian fragmentation and foreign domination. The intellectual legacy of Petrarch's humanism extended far beyond his own literary achievements, establishing methodological and philosophical foundations that would guide European scholarship for centuries. His emphasis on returning ad fontes, or to the sources, motivated subsequent scholars to seek out original texts rather than relying on medieval compilations or summaries. His development of historical consciousness, recognizing that ancient authors wrote in specific contexts that differed from contemporary circumstances, laid groundwork for modern historical methodology. Most significantly, his conviction that classical learning could enhance human dignity and moral development created the intellectual framework for Renaissance education, influencing curriculum development in schools and universities throughout Europe. By the time of Petrarch's death in 1374, the humanist movement he had initiated was beginning to attract followers throughout Italy and beyond. His extensive correspondence had created networks of scholars committed to classical studies, while his literary works provided models for combining ancient learning with contemporary expression. The manuscripts he had discovered and preserved were being copied and disseminated, making classical texts available to larger audiences than had been possible since antiquity. These developments established the foundation for the broader cultural transformation that historians recognize as the mature Renaissance, setting the stage for the remarkable intellectual and artistic achievements that would characterize the following century. This intellectual foundation would prove particularly fertile in the specific context of Florence, where unique economic and political circumstances were converging to create unprecedented opportunities for cultural patronage and artistic innovation. By the early decades of the 15th century, Florence had emerged as one of Europe's most prosperous commercial centers. Its wealth derived primarily from textile manufacturing, international trade, and most significantly, banking operations that extended across the known world. The city's population, which historians estimate had reached approximately 80,000 inhabitants by 1400, represented a remarkable concentration of merchants, craftsmen, and intellectuals whose interactions would catalyze the most intensive period of Renaissance creativity. The foundation of Florence's extraordinary influence during this period can be traced to the systematic development of banking practices that revolutionized European commerce. Italian merchants had been refining techniques of credit, currency exchange, and international finance throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. But it was in Florence that these methods achieved their most sophisticated expression. Records indicate that by 1338, the city housed no fewer than 80 banking houses, many of which maintained branch offices in London, Bruges, Paris, and Constantinople. This financial network created streams of capital that would ultimately fund the architectural projects, artistic commissions, and scholarly endeavors that defined Renaissance culture. Among the numerous banking families that competed for dominance in Florence's financial sector, none would achieve the lasting influence and political power of the Medici. The family's rise from relatively modest origins to unprecedented wealth and authority represents one of the most remarkable examples of social mobility in medieval European history. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, born approximately 1360, established the foundation of the family's banking empire when he founded the Medici Bank in 1397. His strategic decision to relocate the bank's headquarters to Florence, combined with his cautious approach to lending and his cultivation of relationships with church officials, enabled the institution to survive the financial crises that destroyed many of his competitors. Giovanni's banking innovations extended far beyond simple money lending. He developed sophisticated systems for managing currency exchange across different European markets, created standardized procedures for evaluating creditworthiness, and established correspondent relationships with financial institutions throughout the Mediterranean world. By 1420, the Medici Bank operated branches in Rome, Venice, Naples, Milan, Geneva, Bruges, and London, making it arguably the most extensive financial network of its era. The bank's annual profits, which contemporary records suggest exceeded 40,000 florins by the 1420s, provided the family with resources that surpassed those of many European princes. The political implications of this financial success became apparent during the career of Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, who inherited control of the banking empire in 1429. Cosimo, who would later be known as Cosimo the Elder or Pater Patriae, recognized that economic power alone would not guarantee his family's long-term security in Florence's intensely competitive political environment. The city's republican government, dominated by wealthy merchant families who viewed the Medici's growing influence with suspicion, posed constant threats to the family's interests. Cosimo's approach to this challenge demonstrated remarkable political sophistication. Rather than seeking formal political office, which would have made him a target for his enemies, he chose to exercise influence indirectly through strategic alliances, carefully distributed loans, and systematic patronage of artists, scholars, and public works. This method proved highly effective in 1433, when rival families succeeded in having him exiled from Florence on charges of tyranny. The disruption to the city's financial system caused by Cosimo's absence, combined with the loyalty he had cultivated among various social classes, enabled him to return triumphantly in 1434, with his political position stronger than ever. The period following Cosimo's return marked the beginning of Medici political dominance that would continue with various interruptions for nearly 3 centuries. Historians generally regard the years between 1434 and 1464, the year of Cosimo's death, as the foundation period of Medici cultural patronage. During these 3 decades, Cosimo systematically invested banking profits in projects designed to enhance both his family's prestige and Florence's cultural prominence. His expenditures on art, architecture, and scholarship, which contemporary sources indicate totaled more than 600,000 florins, represented an unprecedented commitment of private resources to cultural development. Cosimo's patronage activities reflected both personal interests and calculated political strategy. His support for humanist scholars, including Marsilio Ficino and the Byzantine refugee Gemistos Plethon, helped establish Florence as Europe's leading center for the study of classical philosophy. The Platonic Academy that developed under Medici sponsorship became a gathering place for intellectuals from across Europe, creating networks of scholarly communication that accelerated the spread of Renaissance ideas. Similarly, Cosimo's architectural commissions, including the reconstruction of the San Marco Monastery and the construction of the Medici Palace, provided highly visible demonstrations of the family's commitment to Florence's welfare. The banking operations that funded these cultural activities continued to expand throughout Cosimo's lifetime. By 1450, historians estimate that the Medici Bank controlled approximately half of Florence's foreign exchange business and maintained correspondent relationships with financial institutions in over 20 European cities. The bank's lending practices had evolved to include not only commercial loans, but also significant advances to European rulers, including substantial credits to Edward IV of England and Charles the Bold of Burgundy. These political loans, while risky, generated enormous profits and established the Medici as influential players in international diplomacy. The organizational structure that Cosimo developed for managing these far-flung operations became a model for subsequent banking enterprises. Each branch office operated with considerable autonomy under the supervision of locally appointed managers, but all major decisions required approval from Florence headquarters. Detailed accounting procedures, standardized throughout the system, enabled centralized monitoring of profits and losses across the entire network. Perhaps most innovatively, Cosimo implemented a profit-sharing system that gave branch managers direct financial incentives to maximize their office's performance, a practice that contributed significantly to the bank's overall success. The cultural impact of Medici financial power extended well beyond direct patronage of artists and scholars. The family's prominence attracted talented individuals to Florence from throughout Europe, creating concentrations of expertise that generated innovations in multiple fields simultaneously. The workshops of sculptors, painters, and architects that flourished under Medici support became training centers where techniques were refined and transmitted to subsequent generations. Similarly, the libraries and scholarly resources that the family accumulated provided research materials that enabled humanist scholars to make fundamental contributions to the understanding of classical antiquity. Records from the 1450s indicate that Cosimo's annual expenditures on cultural patronage had reached levels that concerned even his close advisors. His investments in manuscript acquisition alone exceeded 10,000 florins per year, while his architectural projects required additional sums that sometimes strained even the Medici Bank's substantial resources. However, these expenditures generated returns that extended far beyond financial calculation. The prestige associated with Medici patronage attracted business opportunities that more than compensated for cultural investments, while the family's reputation for supporting learning and art provided protection against political attacks. The death of Cosimo de' Medici in 1464 marked the end of the foundational period of the family's cultural influence. But the systems he had established continued to generate both profits and prestige for his successors. His son, Piero the Gouty, despite suffering from chronic illness, maintained the banking operations and patronage activities that his father had developed. Although Piero's 5-year tenure as head of the family was marked by financial difficulties and political challenges, he succeeded in preserving the essential elements of Medici power and influence. The transition to the leadership of Piero's son Lorenzo, later known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, would inaugurate what historians generally consider the most brilliant period of Medici cultural patronage. However, the foundation for Lorenzo's achievements had been established during the preceding decades through the systematic development of financial resources and political relationships that his grandfather and father had constructed. The banking empire that Giovanni de' Medici had founded in 1397 had evolved by 1469 into an international financial network that generated the resources necessary to support cultural activities on an unprecedented scale. The broader significance of the Medici banking empire's rise extends beyond its role in financing Renaissance culture. The family's success demonstrated the possibility of translating commercial wealth into lasting political and cultural influence, providing a model that other merchant families throughout Europe would attempt to emulate. Their innovations in banking practice, including sophisticated risk assessment, international currency exchange, and systematic record keeping, establish precedents that influenced the development of modern financial institutions. Most importantly for the Renaissance, their systematic patronage of learning and art created an environment in which intellectual and creative innovation could flourish, establishing patterns of cultural support that would characterize the movement's most productive phases. The systematic patronage of learning and art that characterized the Medici banking dynasty found one of its most profound expressions in the revolutionary architectural innovations of Filippo Brunelleschi, whose work fundamentally transformed not only the physical landscape of Florence, but the very principles by which Renaissance artists and architects understood space, proportion, and visual representation. Born in Florence in 1377, Brunelleschi initially trained as a goldsmith and sculptor before turning his attention to architectural problems that had confounded builders for generations. Historical records indicate that his early exposure to both the practical mechanics of metalwork and the theoretical principles of Roman engineering would prove crucial to his later architectural achievements. The most celebrated of Brunelleschi's innovations emerged from his solution to a construction challenge that had remained unresolved for over a century. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, begun in 1296 under the direction of Arnolfo di Cambio, featured an octagonal crossing that was intended to support an enormous dome. By the early 15th century, the cathedral remained incomplete precisely because no architect had successfully determined how to construct a dome of the required dimensions without employing traditional wooden centering, which would have required timber resources that simply did not exist in the quantities necessary for such an undertaking. Historians believe that Brunelleschi's solution, developed between approximately 1417 and 1419, drew upon his careful study of Roman construction techniques, particularly those employed in the Pantheon in Rome, which he had examined during extended visits to the city between 1402 and 1404. Brunelleschi's dome, completed in 1436, employed a double-shell construction technique that distributed weight through a series of internal ribs and chains, eliminating the need for external buttressing while creating an internal structure that was essentially self-supporting during construction. The outer shell, constructed of brick laid in a herringbone pattern, was connected to the inner shell through a complex system of stone and iron elements that transferred structural loads in ways that contemporary builders found difficult to comprehend. Records from the Opera del Duomo, the cathedral's building committee, document extensive debates about Brunelleschi's unconventional methods, including his refusal to provide detailed drawings of his structural system, apparently from concern that competitors might appropriate his innovations. The mathematical principles underlying Brunelleschi's architectural achievements extended beyond purely structural considerations to encompass his revolutionary development of linear perspective, a system of visual representation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Renaissance art. It is said that Brunelleschi first demonstrated his perspective system around 1415 through two experimental panels, now lost, that depicted the Baptistery of San Giovanni and the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence. Contemporary accounts, particularly those recorded by the architect and theorist Antonio Manetti in the later 15th century, describe how Brunelleschi positioned observers at specific points and used mirrors to demonstrate that his painted representations achieved mathematical accuracy in their depiction of architectural recession and proportional relationships. The theoretical foundation of linear perspective rested upon geometric principles that Brunelleschi apparently derived from his study of classical optical treatises, including works by Euclid and Ptolemy that had been preserved in medieval manuscripts and were becoming increasingly available to Renaissance scholars through the expansion of library collections and the activities of humanist translators. Brunelleschi's system established a mathematical relationship between the eye of the observer, the picture plane, and the objects being depicted, creating a coherent method for representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Historians believe that his perspective system incorporated elements of practical surveying techniques that he had encountered in his work on architectural projects, as well as theoretical principles derived from ancient treatises on optics and geometry. The architectural projects through which Brunelleschi implemented and refined his innovations provide extensive documentation of his systematic approach to problems of space, proportion, and structural engineering. The Ospedale degli Innocenti, commissioned in 1419 by the Silk Guild of Florence, represented one of the first architectural projects in which Brunelleschi applied classical proportional systems to the design of a complete building complex. The hospital's facade, featuring a loggia supported by Corinthian columns, employed mathematical ratios derived from Roman architectural treatises, particularly the work of Vitruvius, whose manuscripts were being studied with renewed interest by Renaissance architects and theorists. Contemporary records indicate that Brunelleschi's design for the Ospedale degli Innocenti established proportional relationships between individual architectural elements that created visual harmony through mathematical precision rather than through the accumulated additions and modifications that characterized medieval building practices. The height of the columns, the width of the arches, the dimensions of the spandrels decorated with Andrea della Robbia's ceramic medallions, and the relationship between the loggia and the upper story all reflected calculated ratios that could be expressed in simple mathematical terms. This systematic approach to architectural proportion would influence generations of Renaissance architects, including Leon Battista Alberti, who codified many of Brunelleschi's innovations in his architectural treatises. The Church of San Lorenzo, begun around 1421, provided Brunelleschi with an opportunity to apply his innovations to the traditional problems of ecclesiastical architecture. Records from the Medici family archives document their extensive financial support for the project, which was intended to serve as the parish church for the Medici neighborhood and eventually as a mausoleum for family members. Brunelleschi's design employed a basilican plan that incorporated classical elements within a framework that satisfied contemporary liturgical requirements, creating interior spaces that demonstrated the visual effects of mathematical perspective while accommodating the functional needs of religious services. The nave of San Lorenzo, with its repetitive bay system defined by Corinthian columns and classical entablatures, created precisely the kind of architectural recession that Brunelleschi had explored in his perspective experiments. Historians believe that the church's interior was specifically designed to demonstrate the visual effects of linear perspective, with sightlines that drew the observer's attention toward the altar through a series of mathematically calculated intervals. The relationship between the height of the columns, the width of the nave, and the proportions of the individual bays reflected the same systematic approach to architectural proportion that Brunelleschi had employed at the Ospedale degli Innocenti. The Pazzi Chapel, commissioned by the banking family that would later mount an unsuccessful conspiracy against the Medici, represented perhaps the most refined application of Brunelleschi's architectural principles. Begun around 1441, the chapel employed a centralized plan that created perfect symmetrical relationships between all architectural elements, while incorporating a dome that demonstrated the structural innovations Brunelleschi had developed for the cathedral. The interior space, with its grey stone architectural elements contrasted against white walls, created an environment in which the mathematical relationships underlying the design became visually apparent to observers, effectively serving as a three-dimensional demonstration of the geometric principles that governed Renaissance architectural theory. Contemporary treatises on architecture, including works by Filarete and Francesco di Giorgio Martini, document the widespread influence of Brunelleschi's innovations throughout the Italian peninsula and beyond. Architects working in cities as diverse as Milan, Venice, Naples, and eventually Paris and London adapted elements of his system to local building traditions and materials, creating regional variations that maintained the essential principles of classical proportion and linear perspective, while accommodating different climatic conditions, available materials, and cultural preferences. Records indicate that manuscript copies of Brunelleschi's architectural drawings circulated among architects and patrons throughout Europe, spreading knowledge of his innovations even to regions where direct contact with his completed buildings was impossible. The theoretical implications of Brunelleschi's architectural revolution extended far beyond purely technical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between mathematical knowledge and artistic creation. His systematic approach to problems of proportion and spatial representation suggested that architectural beauty could be achieved through the application of rational principles rather than through intuitive or traditional methods, establishing precedents that would influence not only architecture, but painting, sculpture, and even musical composition throughout the Renaissance period. Leon Battista Alberti's architectural treatises, written during the middle decades of the 15th century, provided the most comprehensive documentation of Brunelleschi's theoretical contributions, establishing connections between his practical innovations and classical architectural theory, while extending his principles to encompass broader questions about the relationship between architecture and society. Alberti's work, particularly his De Re Edificatoria, completed around 1452, systematized many of Brunelleschi's insights while placing them within a broader framework of humanist learning that connected architectural practice to philosophy, mathematics, history, and moral philosophy. Through Alberti's writings, Brunelleschi's innovations gained theoretical authority that ensured their continued influence throughout the remainder of the Renaissance period and beyond. This theoretical foundation that Alberti provided would prove instrumental in shaping the broader artistic developments of the Quattrocento, as the 15th century came to be known by Italian scholars. The term Quattrocento, literally meaning 400, in reference to the 1400s, encompasses a period of unprecedented artistic innovation that extended far beyond architectural theory into the realms of painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. During this century, the patronage system that had begun to emerge in Florence during Brunelleschi's time expanded and systematized itself, creating networks of artistic production that would fundamentally alter the relationship between artists, their sponsors, and society at large. The Medici family's influence during this period cannot be overstated, particularly under the leadership of Cosimo de' Medici, who assumed control of the family's banking operations around 1434, following his return from exile. Cosimo, often referred to by historians as Cosimo the Elder, established what scholars now recognize as the first systematic approach to artistic patronage in the modern sense. His commissioning practices, which began in earnest during the 1440s, included not only architectural projects, but also manuscripts, paintings, and sculptural works that served both devotional and political purposes. Records from the Medici archives, preserved in the Florentine State Archives, indicate that Cosimo spent approximately 40,000 florins on artistic and architectural commissions between 1434 and 1464, a sum that historians estimate would equal several $1 million in contemporary currency. The workshop system that emerged during the Quattrocento represented a significant evolution from the medieval guild structure that had previously dominated artistic production. Master artists such as Andrea del Verrocchio, who established his workshop in Florence around 1460, created educational environments that functioned simultaneously as commercial enterprises, artistic laboratories, and intellectual centers. Verrocchio's workshop, located on Via de Agnolo, became particularly renowned for its systematic approach to artistic training, combining traditional craft techniques with a new humanist emphasis on mathematical proportion and classical learning. It is documented that Verrocchio's workshop employed approximately 15 to 20 individuals at any given time, including master craftsmen, journeymen, and apprentices ranging in age from 12 to 30 years. The workshop's output during the 1460s and 1470s included bronze sculptures, painted altarpieces, decorative objects, and architectural ornaments, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of artistic production during this period. Among the most significant apprentices to emerge from Verrocchio's workshop was Leonardo da Vinci, who joined the establishment around 1466 at the age of 14 and remained there until approximately 1476, when he was admitted to the Florentine Painters Guild as an independent master. The patronage networks that sustained these workshops extended throughout Italian society, encompassing not only wealthy merchant families, but also religious institutions, civic organizations, and emerging princely courts. The Sassetti family, prominent Florentine bankers and wool merchants, commissioned Domenico Ghirlandaio to create a fresco cycle for their chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita between 1483 and 1486. These frescoes, depicting scenes from the life of St. Francis, cost the family approximately 800 florins and required nearly 3 years to complete, illustrating both the financial commitment and temporal investment required for major artistic projects during this period. Religious patronage during the Quattrocento underwent significant transformation as monastic orders and secular clergy adapted to the new artistic styles emerging from humanist culture. The Dominican monastery of San Marco in Florence, renovated under Cosimo de' Medici's patronage beginning in 1436, became a showcase for the integration of traditional religious devotion with Renaissance artistic innovation. Fra Angelico, the Dominican painter whose real name was Guido di Pietro, created approximately 50 frescoes throughout the monastery between 1438 and 1445, each carefully designed to serve the contemplative needs of the religious community while incorporating the perspective techniques and naturalistic details characteristic of early Renaissance art. The economic foundations of Quattrocento patronage rested upon the continued expansion of international trade and banking that had begun during the previous century. Florence's wool industry, which processed approximately 70,000 pieces of cloth annually during the mid-15th century, generated the surplus wealth that enabled both individual and corporate artistic commissions. The Arte di Lana, Florence's wool guild, commissioned numerous works of art for their guild hall and associated religious foundations, including altarpieces, ceremonial objects, and architectural decorations that celebrated both their patron saints and their commercial success. Banking families throughout central and northern Italy followed the Medici model of artistic patronage, creating regional centers of Renaissance culture that reflected local traditions while incorporating Florentine innovations. In Milan, the Sforza family, who assumed control of the duchy in 1450, established a court that attracted artists and scholars from throughout Europe. Francesco Sforza and his successors commissioned architectural projects, manuscript illuminations, and decorative arts that served both ceremonial and propagandistic purposes, demonstrating their legitimacy as rulers and their sophistication as cultural leaders. The technical innovations that characterized Quattrocento art emerged directly from the interaction between traditional craft knowledge and humanist learning fostered within these patronage networks. Oil painting techniques, which had been developed in Northern Europe during the early 15th century, were gradually adopted by Italian artists who modified these methods to suit local preferences and climatic conditions. Antonello da Messina, a Sicilian painter who had studied Flemish techniques during travels in the Low Countries around 1450, returned to Italy and established workshops in Naples and Venice, where he taught these methods to local artists during the 1470s. The development of printmaking during the latter half of the Quattrocento represents another significant technological advancement that transformed artistic production and distribution. Engraving techniques, possibly introduced to Italy through German craftsmen working in Venice during the 1460s, enabled the mass production of artistic images for the first time in European history. Andrea Mantegna, court artist to the Gonzaga family in Mantua, created approximately 20 engraved prints between 1465 and 1490, demonstrating how established artists adapted these new techniques to expand their artistic reach and commercial opportunities. Regional variations in patronage patterns reflected local political and economic conditions throughout the Italian peninsula. In Venice, where merchant families maintained extensive international trading networks, artistic commissions often reflected cosmopolitan influences drawn from Byzantine, Islamic, and Northern European sources. The Bellini family workshop, active throughout the second half of the 15th century, created paintings and altarpieces that incorporated these diverse stylistic elements while maintaining distinctly Venetian characteristics derived from the city's unique architectural and cultural environment. Jacopo Bellini, the patriarch of this artistic dynasty, maintained detailed sketchbooks that survive today in the collections of the British Museum and the Louvre, providing historians with invaluable documentation of artistic practices during the mid-Quattrocento. These sketchbooks, containing approximately 250 drawings completed between 1440 and 1470, revealed a systematic approach to composition and design that characterized professional artistic practice during this period. The drawings include architectural studies, figure compositions, landscape elements, and decorative motifs that were subsequently incorporated into painted works commissioned by Venetian religious institutions and private collectors. The emergence of portraiture as a distinct artistic genre during the Quattrocento reflects the period's emphasis on individual achievement and social status that was fostered by humanist culture. Domenico Ghirlandaio's workshop produced dozens of portrait paintings during the 1480s and 1490s, documenting the appearance and social aspirations of Florence's merchant class with unprecedented precision and psychological insight. These portraits, typically painted on wooden panels measuring approximately 18 by 14 inches, required between 4 and 6 weeks to complete and cost clients between 15 and 30 florins, depending upon the complexity of costume and background details. The patronage system's influence extended to manuscript production, where traditional illumination techniques were adapted to incorporate Renaissance artistic innovations. The workshop of Vespasiano da Bisticci, Florence's most prominent manuscript dealer during the mid-15th century, employed approximately 40 scribes and illuminators who produced luxury manuscripts for wealthy collectors throughout Europe. Between 1440 and 1480, this workshop completed over 800 manuscripts, including classical texts, religious works, and contemporary humanist writings, each individually tailored to meet specific client requirements regarding decoration, binding, and textual accuracy. Civic patronage during the Quattrocento reflected the growing importance of republican ideals and communal identity that characterized Italian urban culture. The city of Siena commissioned Pinturicchio to decorate the Piccolomini Library in their cathedral between 1502 and 1508, creating a fresco cycle that celebrated the achievements of Pope Pius II, a native son who had brought international prestige to their city. This project, which cost the city government approximately 2,000 florins, required the coordination of numerous craftsmen, including painters, plasterers, carpenters, and metalworkers, demonstrating the collaborative nature of major artistic undertakings during this period. The systematic documentation of artistic contracts and payment records from the Quattrocento provides modern historians with detailed insights into the practical aspects of artistic production during this formative period. These documents, preserved in numerous Italian archives, reveal standardized practices regarding material costs, labor expenses, completion schedules, and quality expectations that governed the relationship between patrons and artists throughout the Renaissance period. Such institutional frameworks established during the Quattrocento would prove foundational for understanding the career trajectory of Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, born on April 15, 1452, in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, approximately 25 miles west of Florence. Records from the period indicate that Leonardo was the illegitimate son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary, and Caterina, a peasant woman whose exact identity remains disputed among historians. This circumstance of illegitimate birth, while socially limiting in certain respects, paradoxically freed Leonardo from the traditional expectation of following his father's notarial profession, thereby allowing his artistic inclinations to flourish under different circumstances than might otherwise have been possible. The young Leonardo's early education appears to have been relatively informal by the standards of his social class. Unlike legitimate sons of professional families who typically received comprehensive Latin instruction and formal academic training, Leonardo's education was conducted primarily in the vernacular Italian of the period. Modern scholars believe this limitation in classical languages may have contributed to his later emphasis on direct observation and empirical investigation, rather than reliance on established textual authorities. Historical documents suggest that around 1466, when Leonardo was approximately 14 years old, his father arranged for him to enter the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, one of the most prestigious artistic establishments of the period. Verrocchio's workshop, located in the Santa Maria delle Grazie district of Florence, represented the epitome of Renaissance artistic education and production methods. The establishment functioned simultaneously as a training ground for apprentices, a commercial enterprise for artistic commissions, and a center for technical innovation in various media, including painting, sculpture, and metalworking. Contemporary records indicate that Verrocchio maintained contracts with numerous prominent Florentine families and religious institutions, providing Leonardo with direct exposure to the sophisticated patronage networks that dominated artistic production during this period. The workshop's systematic approach to artistic instruction emphasized a technical proficiency in drawing, the preparation of materials, and the careful study of human anatomy and natural forms. During his apprenticeship period, which lasted approximately from 1466 to 1476, Leonardo demonstrated exceptional aptitude in multiple areas of artistic practice. Vasari's later biographical account, while requiring careful scholarly interpretation due to its 16th century perspective, suggests that Leonardo's contributions to Verrocchio's works became increasingly significant during these formative years. The painting known as the Baptism of Christ, completed around 1472 to 1475, provides documentary evidence of this collaborative relationship, with art historians generally attributing the angel figure on the left side of the composition to Leonardo's hand, based on stylistic analysis and technical examination of the work's layers. The Guild of St. Luke records indicate that Leonardo achieved independent master status by 1472, when he was approximately 20 years old, though he appears to have remained associated with Verrocchio's workshop for several additional years. This period of continued association reflects the common practice among Renaissance artists of maintaining connections with established workshops even after achieving technical independence. Leonardo's earliest documented independent commission appears to have been an altarpiece for the Chapel of San Bernardo in the Palazzo della Signoria, contracted in January 1478, though historical evidence suggests this work was never completed, establishing a pattern that would characterize many of Leonardo's subsequent projects throughout his career. The incomplete nature of many of Leonardo's artistic works has been extensively documented by Renaissance historians, who have identified numerous factors contributing to this characteristic aspect of his working methods. Contemporary sources suggest that Leonardo's perfectionist tendencies, combined with his wide-ranging intellectual interests and frequent acceptance of new commissions before completing existing ones, created a pattern of project abandonment that frustrated patrons throughout his career. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned by the Augustinian monks of San Donato a Scopeto in 1481, exemplifies this pattern, remaining unfinished despite extensive preparatory work that reveals Leonardo's increasingly sophisticated approach to compositional planning and psychological characterization. Leonardo's departure from Florence around 1482 marked a significant transition in his career trajectory, as he sought patronage at the court of Ludovico Sforza in Milan. The letter of introduction that Leonardo apparently prepared for this purpose, preserved in the Codex Atlanticus, provides remarkable insight into his self-perception and the range of skills he considered marketable to potential patrons. The document emphasizes military engineering capabilities, hydraulic projects, architectural planning, and sculptural work, with painting mentioned only briefly near the end of the enumerated qualifications. This prioritization reflects the practical realities of court patronage during the period, where rulers often valued technical and military expertise as highly as, or more highly than, purely artistic accomplishments. The Milanese period, lasting approximately from 1482 to 1499, proved to be among the most productive and influential phases of Leonardo's career. Court records from the Sforza archives document his involvement in numerous projects, ranging from the design of court entertainments and theatrical machinery to serious architectural and engineering undertakings. The commission for an equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, occupied Leonardo's attention intermittently throughout this period and would have represented, if completed, one of the largest bronze sculptures attempted since classical antiquity. Preparatory drawings and technical studies for this project, preserved in various European collections, demonstrate Leonardo's systematic approach to problems of proportion, structural engineering, and bronze casting techniques. Concurrent with these large-scale projects, Leonardo began the systematic compilation of observational notes and theoretical investigations that would eventually comprise thousands of pages of manuscript material. These codices, written in Leonardo's characteristic mirror script from right to left, cover an extraordinary range of subjects, including anatomy, geology, botany, astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. The anatomical studies, based on direct dissection of human cadavers,
obtained through arrangements with hospitals and religious institutions, achieved a level of accuracy that would not be surpassed until the systematic anatomical investigations of the 17th century. Leonardo's collaboration with Marcantonio della Torre, a professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia around 1510 to 1511, represents one of the few documented instances of formal scholarly cooperation in his investigative work. The Last Supper, painted on the north wall of the refectory in the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan, between approximately 1495 and 1498, stands as perhaps Leonardo's most celebrated completed work from this period. The commission, arranged through Ludovico Sforza's patronage, presented Leonardo with the opportunity to experiment with innovative painting techniques and compositional strategies on a monumental scale. Rather than employing the traditional fresco method, which required rapid application of pigments to wet plaster, Leonardo chose to work with an experimental tempera and oil technique on dry wall preparation, allowing for the subtle gradations and detailed finishing that characterize the completed work. Unfortunately, this technical innovation proved problematic from a conservation standpoint, and contemporary accounts indicate that deterioration of the painted surface was already noticeable within decades of the work's completion. The fall of Ludovico Sforza to French forces in 1499 necessitated Leonardo's departure from Milan and initiated a period of geographical mobility that would characterize the remainder of his career. Records indicate brief residences in Venice, where he consulted on fortification projects against Turkish naval threats, and in Florence, where he received the commission for the Battle of Anghiari fresco in the Palazzo Vecchio. This latter project, intended to complement Michelangelo's planned Battle of Cassina on the opposite wall of the same chamber, would have created an unprecedented artistic dialogue between the two masters. Though neither work progressed beyond the cartoon stage, Leonardo's experimental painting technique for this project, involving the use of heat to set oil-based pigments, proved technically unsuccessful, and the work was abandoned around 1506. The relationship between Leonardo and the French court, initiated during the Milanese occupation, developed into a significant source of patronage during his later career. Francis I, who assumed the French throne in 1515, demonstrated particular interest in securing Leonardo's services and eventually succeeded in persuading him to relocate to France in 1516. The arrangement provided Leonardo with residence at the Château du Clos Lucé, near Amboise, along with a generous annual pension and minimal specific obligations, allowing him considerable freedom to continue his theoretical investigations and artistic projects. Contemporary accounts suggest that the aging master's right hand had become partially paralyzed by this time, limiting his ability to paint, though he continued work on several portraits, most notably the enigmatic work now known as the Mona Lisa, which he had apparently carried with him from Italy. Leonardo's death on May 2nd, 1519, at Clos Lucé marked the end of a career that had spanned nearly 5 decades and had encompassed achievements in multiple fields of Renaissance intellectual activity. The inventory of his possessions, compiled shortly after his death, provides valuable documentation
of the scope of his interests and the extent of his manuscript legacy. These documents passed to his pupil Francesco Melzi, who attempted to organize and preserve the vast collection of notes and drawings, though subsequent dispersal of the material has complicated modern efforts to reconstruct the full extent of Leonardo's theoretical work. The impact of his innovations in artistic technique, scientific methodology, and engineering practice continued to influence European intellectual development well beyond the chronological boundaries of the Renaissance period itself. This intellectual legacy, established by Leonardo's systematic approach to both artistic creation and scientific inquiry, created the foundation upon which the next generation of Renaissance masters would build their own revolutionary contributions. Among these figures, none would achieve greater prominence in the papal capital than Michelangelo Buonarroti, whose arrival in Rome in the year 1501 marked the beginning of what art historians commonly term the High Renaissance period in that city. The political and cultural circumstances that drew Michelangelo to Rome were intimately connected to the ambitious rebuilding programs initiated by Pope Julius II, who ascended to the papal throne in 1503, with grand visions of transforming Rome into a visual manifestation of papal authority and Christian triumph. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni had been born in the small Tuscan town of Caprese on March 6, 1475. During his father Lodovico's brief tenure as the local podesta or magistrate, the family's origins traced back to minor Florentine nobility, though their circumstances had declined considerably by the time of Michelangelo's birth. His early artistic training began around 1488, when he was apprenticed to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio in Florence, though this arrangement lasted only briefly before the young artist's talents attracted the attention of Lorenzo de' Medici. Under the patronage of the Medici family, Michelangelo gained access to classical sculptures and humanist learning that would profoundly shape his artistic philosophy. The political upheavals that followed Lorenzo's death in 1492 and the subsequent expulsion of the Medici from Florence in 1494 forced Michelangelo to seek opportunities elsewhere. His first significant commission in Rome came through the influence of Cardinal Riario, who arranged for the artist to create the Pietà for the French Cardinal Jean de Belair. This marble sculpture, completed between 1498 and 1499, established Michelangelo's reputation in the papal city and demonstrated his mastery of both technical skill and emotional expression within the constraints of religious subject matter. The return of Michelangelo to Florence in 1501 coincided with the commission for the colossal statue of David, carved from a single block of Carrara marble that had been abandoned by previous sculptors. The completion of this work in 1504 enhanced his reputation throughout Italy, but it was Pope Julius II's summons to Rome in 1505 that would define the most productive period of Michelangelo's career. Julius, born Giuliano della Rovere, had spent years in exile during the Borgia papacy and returned to power with determination to restore papal prestige through magnificent artistic patronage and ambitious architectural projects. The initial commission that brought Michelangelo back to Rome involved the design and construction of an elaborate tomb for Julius himself, a project that the artist would later describe as the tragedy of his life due to its repeated interruptions and modifications. The original design, conceived in 1505, called for a massive freestanding monument incorporating more than 40 marble figures, including bound slaves, prophets, and allegorical representations that would celebrate both papal authority and Christian doctrine. The estimated cost of this undertaking was approximately 10,000 ducats, an enormous sum that reflected both Julius's ambitions and the scale of artistic production characteristic of high Renaissance Rome. However, the tomb project was soon overshadowed by an even more demanding commission that would occupy Michelangelo for the next 4 years. In 1508, Pope Julius convinced the reluctant artist to accept responsibility for painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the papal chapel constructed under Sixtus IV in the 1470s. Michelangelo's initial resistance to this commission stemmed from his self-identification as a sculptor rather than a painter, though historians note that he had received training in fresco technique during his brief apprenticeship with Ghirlandaio. The Sistine Chapel ceiling project presented extraordinary technical and artistic challenges that required Michelangelo to develop innovative solutions for painting on the curved surface approximately 68 feet above the chapel floor. The iconographic program, developed in consultation with papal theologians, encompassed 9 scenes from the Book of Genesis, surrounded by prophets, sibyls, ignudi, and other figures that together created a comprehensive visual theology spanning from the creation of the world to the preparation for Christ's coming. The physical demands of this work were considerable, requiring Michelangelo to paint while lying on his back on scaffolding for hours each day, a process he later described in a sonnet, complaining of the neck pain and physical discomfort this position caused. The actual painting process began in 1508 with the scene of Noah's drunkenness and progressed toward the altar wall, concluding with the creation scenes that demonstrate Michelangelo's increasing confidence and mastery of large-scale composition. Art historians have identified a clear evolution in the artist's technique throughout the 4-year project, with the earlier scenes showing more detailed and crowded compositions, while the later work displays greater monumentality and simplified forms. The final scene, depicting the separation of light from darkness, was completed in 1512, the same year that Julius II died, leaving many of his grand projects unfinished or modified. The political situation in Rome following Julius's death in February 1513 created uncertainty for artists who had depended on papal patronage. The election of Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo X brought different priorities and artistic preferences to the papal court, though Leo's Florentine origins initially suggested continued opportunities for Michelangelo. However, the new pope's interests lay more in literary culture and musical patronage than in the monumental projects that had characterized his predecessor's reign. This shift in papal priorities contributed to Michelangelo's decision to return to Florence in 1516, to work on the facade of San Lorenzo for the Medici family. The years between 1516 and 1534 marked a period of divided attention for Michelangelo as he attempted to balance commissions in Florence with ongoing obligations in Rome, particularly the persistent demands related to the Julius tomb project. The heirs of Pope Julius continued to press for completion of the memorial, leading to a series of revised contracts that gradually reduced the scope and ambition of the original conception. The contract of 1516 modified the design to a wall monument rather than a freestanding structure, while subsequent agreements in 1526 and 1532 further simplified the project. During this period, Michelangelo's work in Florence included the Medici Chapel, also known as the New Sacristy of San Lorenzo, which housed tombs for Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and Giuliano, Duke of Nemours. The allegorical figures of day, night, dawn, and dusk that adorn these tombs represent some of Michelangelo's most psychologically complex sculptural work, embodying Renaissance concepts of time, mortality, and the relationship between earthly power and eternal salvation. The architectural framework of the chapel also demonstrated his growing interest in structural design, incorporating innovative elements that would influence his later architectural projects. The political upheavals of the 1520s, including the sack of Rome in 1527 by imperial troops and the siege of Florence from 1529 to 1530, further complicated Michelangelo's professional relationships and delayed completion of various projects. His temporary allegiance to the Florentine Republic during the siege created tension with Pope Clement VII, another member of the Medici family, though this conflict was eventually resolved through papal pardons and renewed commissions. The definitive return of Michelangelo to Rome occurred in 1534, when Pope Paul III, born Alessandro Farnese, summoned the aging artist to undertake what would become his final great painting project. The commission for the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel represented both a return to familiar space and a dramatic departure from the optimistic theology of the ceiling frescoes painted 25 years earlier. The Last Judgment, begun in 1536 and completed in 1541, reflected the changed religious and political climate of mid-16th century Rome. The Protestant Reformation had challenged Catholic doctrine and papal authority, while the sack of Rome had demonstrated the vulnerability of the papal city to military assault. These circumstances influenced the darker, more pessimistic tone of Michelangelo's final fresco, which depicted the Second Coming of Christ with unprecedented emotional intensity and theological complexity. The composition abandons the clear architectural framework that had organized the ceiling frescoes in favor of a swirling mass of figures that seemed to spiral around the central figure of Christ the Judge. Contemporary reactions to the Last Judgment varied considerably, with some praising its artistic achievement while others criticized the extensive nudity and unconventional theological interpretations. Biagio da Cesena, the papal master of ceremonies, famously complained that such nude figures were more appropriate for bathhouses than for the Pope's chapel, leading Michelangelo to include his likeness among the damned in hell. These controversies foreshadowed the broader cultural changes associated with the Counter-Reformation, which would impose stricter guidelines on religious art and challenge many of the humanistic values that had characterized earlier Renaissance patronage. The period following completion of The Last Judgment saw Michelangelo's increasing involvement in architectural projects that would define his final decades. In 1538, Pope Paul III appointed him chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica, a position that allowed him to impose his vision on the most important building project in Christendom. His design for the dome, though not completed until after his death in 1564, established the architectural vocabulary that would influence church design throughout Europe and beyond. The specific architectural innovations that Michelangelo brought to St. Peter's reflected his sculptural sensibility and his deep understanding of structural engineering principles derived from careful study of ancient Roman monuments. These architectural innovations would find themselves documented and disseminated with unprecedented speed and accuracy through what historians now recognize as perhaps the most revolutionary technological advancement of the Renaissance period, the printing press. The development of movable type printing in the mid-15th century fundamentally transformed how knowledge, ideas, and artistic concepts spread throughout Europe, creating what scholars describe as an information revolution that paralleled and accelerated the cultural transformation we call the Renaissance. The story of printing's development begins in the Germanic regions of the Holy Roman Empire, specifically in the city of Mainz, where Johannes Gutenberg completed his first printed Bible sometime around 1454 to 1455. Gutenberg's innovations built upon existing technologies from various sources. The concept of movable type had existed in China since the 11th century, developed by Bai Sheng during the Song dynasty, while the basic principles of printing had been known in Europe through woodblock printing techniques imported from Asia. However, Gutenberg's crucial contribution lay in developing a practical system of metal movable type specifically suited to the Latin alphabet and European languages. The technical challenges that Gutenberg overcame were considerable and required innovations in metallurgy, chemistry, and mechanical engineering. He developed a lead tin antimony alloy for casting type that proved both durable and precise. His oil-based ink, adapted from existing paint formulations, adhered properly to metal type and transferred cleanly to paper. The printing press itself, adapted from existing wine and cheese presses, provided the consistent pressure necessary for clear impressions. These seemingly mundane technical details would prove instrumental in transforming European intellectual life. The earliest printed works focused primarily on religious texts, reflecting both the market demands of the time and the substantial investment required for printing projects. Gutenberg's Bible, consisting of approximately 1,200 pages, printed in 2 volumes, required an estimated investment of roughly 800 florins, equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. Despite these costs, printing offered significant advantages over manuscript production. Where a scribe might require a full year to copy a single Bible, a printing press could produce hundreds of identical copies in the same time frame.
The technology spread rapidly throughout Europe following Gutenberg's initial success. By 1465, printing presses operated in Subiaco, Italy, established by German printers Konrad Sweinheim and Arnold Panartz. Venice emerged as a major printing center by 1469, when Johannes de Spira received a monopoly on printing in the city. This monopoly, however, lasted only until de Spira's death in 1470, after which Venice became home to numerous competing printing establishments. The famous Aldine Press, established by Aldus Manutius around 1494, would later revolutionize printing through innovations in typography and the introduction of portable book formats. Paris saw its first printing press established by 1470, while William Caxton introduced printing to England in 1476, setting up his press at Westminster. Caxton's establishment proved particularly significant for the development of English literature, as he printed works by Geoffrey Chaucer, Thomas Malory, and other English authors, helping to standardize English prose style and spelling conventions. By 1500, historians estimate that printing presses operated in over 200 European cities, from Lisbon in the west to Krakow in the east. The economic implications of printing technology extended far beyond the printing establishments themselves. Traditional manuscript production had supported networks of scribes, illuminators, bookbinders, and parchment makers throughout medieval Europe. While printing created new occupations and industries, it also displaced many traditional craftspeople. The transition period, roughly from 1450 to 1500, witnessed significant social and economic tensions as traditional book production methods competed with the new technology. Printing costs vary considerably, depending on the type of publication and intended market. A simple pamphlet of 8 to 16 pages could be produced for relatively modest investment, making written material accessible to merchants, artisans, and other members of the emerging middle classes. Larger works, such as complete editions of classical authors or comprehensive treatises on technical subjects, required substantial capital investment, but offered the possibility of significant profits if they found adequate markets. The famous Nuremberg Chronicle, published by Anton Koberger in 1493, represents one of the most ambitious early printing projects, featuring over 1,800 illustrations and requiring coordination between multiple craftspeople, artists, and financial backers. The spread of printing technology coincided with and facilitated the broader dissemination of Renaissance humanist ideas throughout Europe. Classical texts that had previously existed in only a few manuscript copies suddenly became available in standardized printed editions. The works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and other ancient authors reached scholars in universities and courts across the continent. Marsilio Ficino's translations of Plato's dialogues, first printed in Florence in 1484, made Platonic philosophy accessible to readers who lacked the specialized manuscript connections previously required to study these texts. The printing of vernacular literature proved equally transformative for Renaissance culture. Dante's Divine Comedy appeared in numerous printed editions beginning in 1472, while Petrarch's sonnets reached new audiences
through multiple printing projects throughout the late 15th century. These publications helped establish standardized versions of vernacular languages, contributing to the development of national literary traditions. The printing of grammars and dictionaries further supported this process of linguistic standardization and development. Scientific and technical knowledge also benefited enormously from printing technology. Leon Battista Alberti's treatises on architecture, painting, and sculpture appeared in printed editions that included precise illustrations and diagrams. The scholarly output of Erasmus was remarkably extensive, facilitated in large part by the printing technology that had become widely available throughout Northern Europe by the early 16th century. His Greek New Testament, published by Johann Froben in Basel in 1516, represented a monumental achievement in biblical scholarship. This edition, known as the Textus Receptus, provided the first widely available Greek text of the New Testament since antiquity, accompanied by Erasmus's own Latin translation that differed in several significant respects from the traditional Vulgate version used by the Catholic Church. The production of this work required extensive collaboration between Erasmus and various printing establishments across Europe. Records indicate that Erasmus maintained correspondence with printers in Basel, Venice, Paris, and Antwerp, coordinating the publication of his works while simultaneously revising and updating earlier editions. This collaboration between scholar and printer exemplified the new possibilities that printing technology offered to Renaissance intellectuals, allowing for the rapid dissemination of scholarly work across vast geographical distances while maintaining relatively high standards of textual accuracy. Parallel to these developments in humanistic scholarship, the Northern Renaissance produced remarkable innovations in visual arts, particularly in the German territories and the Low Countries. Albrecht Dürer, born in Nuremberg in 1471, represents perhaps the most significant artistic figure of the Northern Renaissance. Dürer's career demonstrates the complex interaction between traditional Northern European artistic techniques and the new perspectives and methods that were being developed in Italian artistic centers. Dürer's early training took place in his father's goldsmith workshop, where he acquired the technical precision and attention to detail that would characterize his entire artistic output. However, his first journey to Italy, undertaken around 1494, exposed him to the mathematical principles of perspective and proportion that Italian artists had been developing throughout the 15th century. Upon his return to Nuremberg, Dürer began incorporating these techniques into his work while maintaining the meticulous attention to natural detail that characterized Northern European artistic traditions. The synthesis of Northern and Italian artistic approaches is particularly evident in Dürer's printmaking, an art form that flourished in Northern Europe partly due to the region's advanced metalworking traditions. His series of woodcut prints depicting the apocalypse, completed between 1496 and 1498, combined the dramatic religious intensity characteristic of Northern European art with the sophisticated compositional techniques he had observed in Italian works. These prints were distributed throughout Europe via the same trade networks that carried printed books, demonstrating how artistic innovation could be disseminated as efficiently as textual scholarship. Dürer's theoretical writings on art, particularly his 4 books on human proportion, published posthumously in 1528, reveal the extent to which Northern artists were engaging with the mathematical and scientific principles underlying Renaissance artistic innovation. These works were heavily influenced by Italian treatises, particularly those of Leon Battista Alberti, but they also incorporated Dürer's own extensive observations of human anatomy and natural forms. Historians note that this combination of theoretical understanding with practical observation became characteristic of Northern European approaches to artistic knowledge during the Renaissance period. The influence of printing technology on artistic production extended beyond the mere reproduction of images to encompass fundamental changes in how artists conceived of their work and their audiences. Dürer was among the first artists to recognize the commercial potential of printed images, maintaining careful control over the production and distribution of his prints throughout Europe. Records from his workshop indicate that he employed a sophisticated system for marketing his works, utilizing the same merchant networks that distributed other printed materials to reach customers in distant cities. The lion, representing strength and courage, could overcome wolves through direct confrontation, while the fox, symbolizing cunning and intelligence, could recognize and avoid snares that might entrap the unwary ruler. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli provided numerous historical examples to support his theoretical arguments, drawing extensively from both classical antiquity and contemporary events. His analysis of Cesare Borgia's political career, for instance, served to demonstrate how a skilled prince could rapidly acquire and consolidate power in new territories through careful attention to military organization, administrative efficiency, and the strategic elimination of potential rivals. Similarly, his examination of various Roman emperors illustrated the long-term consequences of different approaches to maintaining political authority over extended periods. One of the most controversial aspects of Machiavelli's political theory concerned his treatment of the relationship between political effectiveness and traditional moral considerations. In Chapter 18 of The Prince, he explicitly argued that rulers must sometimes be prepared to act contrary to accepted standards of faith, charity, humanity, and religion in order to preserve their authority and protect their states. This position, which later generations would characterize as Machiavellian, represented a significant challenge to prevailing assumptions about the divine basis of political authority and the moral responsibilities of Christian rulers. Historians believe that Machiavelli initially intended The Prince as a practical guide for Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom he dedicated the work in hopes of securing employment within the restored Medici administration. The treatise was structured as a systematic examination of different types of principalities, the methods by which they could be acquired and maintained, and the various challenges that rulers might expect to encounter in governing their territories. Machiavelli organized his analysis around several key themes, including the importance of maintaining effective military forces, the need for princes to cultivate popular support while controlling potential sources of opposition, and the crucial role of fortuna, or fortune, in determining political outcomes. The concept of fortuna occupied a particularly significant position in Machiavelli's political philosophy, as he sought to explain the apparent randomness of political success and failure that he had observed throughout his diplomatic career. While acknowledging that fortune controlled approximately half of human affairs, Machiavelli argued that skilled political actors could learn to anticipate and respond to changing circumstances through the exercise of virtu, a term that he used to describe the combination of intellectual, moral, and physical qualities necessary for effective political leadership. This dynamic relationship between fortuna and virtu provided Machiavelli with a theoretical framework for understanding how individual agency could operate within the constraints imposed by external circumstances. In addition to The Prince, Machiavelli also composed a more extensive work on political theory titled Discourses on Livy, which he began writing around the same time but did not complete until approximately 1519. While The Prince focused primarily on monarchical forms of government, the Discourses examined the political institutions and practices of Republican Rome, drawing lessons from the historian Titus Livius about the conditions that contributed to the expansion and eventual decline of Roman power. This work revealed a different aspect of Machiavelli's political thought, demonstrating his appreciation for republican government and his understanding of the complex relationship between popular participation and political stability. The Discourses contained Machiavelli's most developed analysis of the concept of the mixed constitution, which combined elements of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic government in a system designed to balance the competing interests of different social groups. Renaissance techniques and ideas persisted in various forms throughout the 17th century, adapted to serve new purposes and express different sensibilities. Classical architectural elements continued to appear in Baroque buildings, but arranged to create effects of movement and drama rather than the static harmony preferred by Renaissance architects. Humanist educational methods remained influential in European schools and universities, though increasingly supplemented by newer approaches to scientific and mathematical instruction. By the middle of the 17th century, what historians recognize as the Baroque era had become fully established across most of Europe. The cultural synthesis that had characterized the Renaissance, with its integration of classical learning, Christian devotion, and empirical investigation, had evolved into new forms of expression that emphasized emotional intensity, dramatic contrast, and systematic analysis of both natural and human phenomena. The Renaissance had lasted approximately 3 centuries, from its origins in 14th century Italy to its transformation into new cultural forms during the early 17th century. Its influence would continue to shape European intellectual and artistic development, but no longer as a living tradition. Instead, Renaissance achievements became part of a classical heritage to be studied, admired, and selectively revived by later generations, seeking to understand or recover elements of this remarkable period in human cultural development. The great figures of the Renaissance, Petrarch and Ficino, Leonardo and Michelangelo, Erasmus and Montaigne, had created new possibilities for human learning and expression. Their work established foundations that would support centuries of subsequent cultural development. The Renaissance vision of human dignity and creative potential, the integration of classical wisdom with contemporary innovation, the patient investigation of natural phenomena. These legacies continued even as the particular cultural moment that had created them faded into history. In the end, the Renaissance had been a transformation, a gradual awakening of new possibilities that emerged slowly from medieval traditions and evolved gradually into the complex cultural forms of the early modern period. Its decline was similarly gradual, a quiet transformation rather than an ending, as its achievements were absorbed into new historical developments that would carry European culture toward different but equally remarkable forms of human expression and understanding. The Renaissance ultimately became memory, but memory that continued to inspire and to shape the long history of European civilization. Thank you for studying with the Sleep Scholar. May your dreams be filled with quiet knowledge. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next lesson.